They have arrived. Finally, they are arriving at the edge of the promised land after all the wandering they had done, beginning with leaving the slavery and genocide of Egypt, walking the path through the Red Sea, trekking through the wilderness of Sinai and the wilderness of Paran. The land promised to their ancestors was about to be theirs. And after all the manna, the quail, the water that God had given them during their long journey, and after all the times they were about to give up only to be turned around so they could continue their journey to this moment, when they were right on the edge of possessing the land and all that it represented. Permanent security, a way to live far surpassing any other way in the world around them. No more would they be somebody's slaves. No more would they be aliens living in a foreign land. No, sir. All of those days are gone. They're dead. It is finished. And like the Irish arriving in America, they were going to own their own land. And all they needed to do was to walk the last few miles of their journey. And just to be sure the land was everything dreamed about, Moses sent an advance team to check out the land. And Caleb and Joshua and several other men made up that team. And after a while, Caleb came back and reported to Moses and to the people that this indeed was a land flowing with milk and honey. They even brought back a few examples of this wondrous land. And they talked about the peoples who were nearby, but they said, let's go, let's walk into this future God is about to give us. Unfortunately, there was another report. And this report, coming from some of the other men of the team, was far more pessimistic. This land is inhabited by giants, they said. We were like grasshoppers. We cannot possibly get past them. They will kill us. We must turn around and go back to Egypt. And they might as well have added, where life was so good and wonderful. We need to go back to the good old days. Now, the Hebrews had two reports. And they had to choose which one they were going to trust. They had to decide who was telling the truth. But their decision was really going to be based on answering only one question that neither report ever mentioned. But it was the most significant question. And curiously enough, it is the same question residing at the heart of celebrating the festival of first fruits, which marks the beginning of the harvest season when the barley was the first grain crop harvested. Now, the festival of first fruits takes place just after the end of the festival of unleavened bread and Passover. And it's really a celebratory feast. And it doesn't really have one particular Exodus story, connected to it. But this festival demands an answer to the singular question God is asking the Hebrews throughout their Exodus wilderness journey. And so it is, in reality, a wilderness-based festival. And at the start of the celebration, none of the barley grain could be eaten until the first harvested barley was taken to the temple and offered to God out of thanksgiving for the blessing of this food. And the priest of the temple would take the grain and would hold it up high and would go to the altar, and they would touch the four corners of the altar. And they would come and bring it down once again. And then they would pour it into a basin. And they'd pour oil on the basin. And they'd pour wine on that. And that was the ritual of that offering. But the significance of this ritual is in the act of not eating the first fruits of the harvest. Because it is an act that raises the question, do the Israelites trust God enough not to worry about sacrificing the first fruits of this harvest? Could they trust God to provide the rest of the barley harvest and the wheat crop harvest in sufficient quantity so that everyone has enough to eat for most of the rest of the year? Remember something about this time. They didn't know anything about predicting the weather. They didn't know if it was going to rain enough for the seeds to germinate and grow the wheat. They didn't know if a swarm of locusts or other insects were going to come along and eat up all of the grains, or if a flood might arise, or maybe an invading army might just come stomping through their land, burning the crops or taking it all for themselves. They lived contingently in a world full of a future of uncertainties, and yet they still had to choose to trust God would provide for them, just as God had done for their ancestors in the wilderness by giving them manna and quail and water and guidance and protection. You see, since God had delivered the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt and brought them to the promised land, God wanted them to freely trust God to provide for all their needs. God wanted them to choose to trust God. That's at the heart of all of the entire wilderness experience. That's what it was supposed to teach the Hebrews, so they could answer the question, do we trust God enough to step into the future God is leading us to live? And the answer that God was hoping they would choose was yes. Well, of course we do. We trust God. And when they said that they would experience God's Spirit working in them and leading them into the future God plans for them. And the question of trust, that is the most important faith question needing to be answered. Because every other decision and choice we make depends on how we answer that one question. It's a faith question because faith means trust. And we are reminded of this by Hebrews 11, verse 1, telling us faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And by the way, the letter to the Hebrews was written to call people to trust God, to trust God's good news in Jesus Christ, and then to live accordingly, which is a hard thing to do because no one knows the future. Not the Hebrews, not even the folks who organized this church back in the 1800s, and not any one of us. The future is out there waiting for us to live into it. And we don't know exactly what will happen to us in our future, nor do we know how our lives are going to unfold. And that's why it's often easier to fit our lives and fill our lives by being involved in soccer and lacrosse and track and theater and music and school and hobbies and our vocations, our civic and our social clubs, allowing all those involvements to consume our time and our energy until we begin thinking that all of that is what will give our lives meaning and purpose and give us our identity. But sadly, none of it does. Because our identity as Christians is deeply rooted in our relationship with God and God's love and God's presence in our lives. And that's why the Hebrews didn't know which report to believe. They had not yet answered that one question. Do we trust God enough to walk into the future God intends us to have and live into it? And without answering that one question, they tried basing their decision on a rational or logical way to discern which report was true. Except there wasn't any. rational, logical way of weighing the evidence or discovering the proof of which report was true and which one would lead them into a future of well-being and peace. The people who began this congregation didn't have a rational or logical way to know what was going to happen next or how this church would be pulled together. They didn't have a church building. They didn't have an endowment fund. They didn't have a marketing scheme based upon various, styles of worship to attract people to join this congregation, because none of those things, quite frankly, existed. They did not even know if any other person would ever join them. The Hebrews and the people who started this congregation were challenged to be risk takers. And there was going to be a lot of risk taking for both, since none of them had certainty that everything would turn out exactly as they planned or hoped it might. The only ironclad, take it to the bank, put it in a savings CD for the rest of your life guarantee they had, is that God was with them. That God will provide all the resources they need, that God's promises and plans will bring forth an abundant life of joy and peace. Which brings us back to the question, do we trust God enough to walk into the future God intends for us? And will we live into that future? The Hebrews came to that question just outside the promised land, and their answer was, oh no, not so much. We're all going to go back to Egypt. See, that's the decision they made, with the exception, of course, of Moses and Aaron, and Caleb and Joshua. They all decided they'd turn around and head back to Egypt in the good old days, because they preferred trusting in the romanticized, reality-denying version of life in Egypt rather than trusting God, who had set them free and provided everything they needed to sustain their life. And the result of their choice was that the first generation of Hebrews condemned themselves to wander in the wilderness for the next 40 years until they all died. And the only ones who didn't die were Moses and Caleb and Joshua, and only Joshua and Caleb would enter the promised land with the second and third generation of Hebrews. And this is why I suspect God commanded the Hebrews, while they were in the wilderness, to celebrate a festival of first fruits, to remind them to celebrate not only the blessings God had given them in those first fruits, but to celebrate that they could trust God to provide them all they needed for life beyond those first fruits. And I believe when the people who organized this congregation came to that same question, do we trust God enough to walk into the future God is leading us to live? They all said, yes, we do. Which is why we are sitting here in this sanctuary today. We are the inheritors of the choice they made, just as much as we are the inheritors of choices made by countless others before us. By, as the letter of the Hebrews tells us, that great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, though I might like to suggest we might like to really call them a cloud of great witnesses, because they have left for us in the pages of Scripture an account of the choices they made when they said, yes, we do trust God enough. We also have the account through histories and stories told about other faithful people: Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Knox, Martin Luther King Jr., Julian of Norwich, Dorothea Day, the founders of Heifer International, Habitat for Humanity, Mother Teresa, who all also said, yes, I do trust God enough. Throughout time and place, Christians have had to answer that question not once, not twice, but countless times. And now, my brothers and sisters, it is your time to answer that question. For we have arrived at that point in our 1.5 year journey where we are coming closer and closer to the future God is designing for you and the one God's designing for me. a future challenging you all to make that commitment to be a church family seeking personal and spiritual growth through praying, experiencing worship, building relationships, serving in mission locally and globally, and to call a pastor to come and partner with you in living into the future of health and vitality that God is leading you to live into for yourselves and for this community. This is why your ministries and your presence here are so vitally important to this community's health and vitality. They are part of the way God is bringing the fullness of God's peace to this community, so it may be experienced by everyone, every person in this community. And I am convinced that's why God called this congregation into being in the first place. And why now God is calling you to reach out to children and families in this community, some of whom are living within blocks of this building and who need the light of Christ to pierce the darkness of their despair. And I believe God is calling you all to bring that light to them. For when you answer the question, do we trust God enough to live into the future God is leading us into, with a resounding, with a courageous yes, you and this community will experience the wonderful deep knowing of being truly free, of finding that you already have a dwelling place in God's presence, that you belong to God, because you will hear God's voice. You will see God's beauty. You will touch God's incarnate word of life, and you will taste fully God's infinite goodness, which is everything you need to live a life just like that life of Jesus and that cloud of great witnesses. Amen.